She laughed.
I really must insist
It was
you
not a cruel
reconsider.
laugh. I want to be
sorry, but I
precise
just
about
can't
this
right
because
now.
the laugh is where the morning starts, and the laugh was not what it could have been. It was the specific involuntary laugh of someone who has done something they find momentarily absurd. A CEO in a $600 jacket spilling coffee on a stranger at 8:40 in the morning, and who laughs at the absurdity before the social management catches up. It lasted 1 second. Then she said, "I'm so sorry. I'm absolutely sorry. Let me,"
Sir, you need to leave.
and reached for napkins from the dispenser on the nearest table, which was my table, and began the specific efficient management of the spill that capable people performed when they had caused a
You once
problem
saved
and
soldiers
intended to
during a
correct
dangerous
it.
mission.
The
Earned a
coffee
medal.
was on my left shoulder. I pulled the collar away from my shoulder to assess the damage. An automatic gesture, the specific practical movement of someone trying to understand what had been ruined and what could be saved. The collar shifted. The scar was visible. Her hands went still. She was holding the napkins in both hands, and she had been in the process of extending them to me, and her hands went still, and she looked at the scar on my left shoulder and upper chest, the large, irregular scar that was the permanent record of a 7.62 millimeter round entering from the front, which meant I had been facing the direction it came from, which meant something specific about where I had been and what I had been doing when I was hit. She knew what it meant. She looked at the scar for 1 second. She looked at my face. She said, "Kunar Province, 2014. It was not a question. I looked at her. She was 42 years old, in the $600 jacket, with the specific quality of someone who had spent 10 years in an environment that required precision, and who had brought that precision into the civilian life that followed. Not the precision of a desk, the precision of someone who had learned to assess situations correctly and quickly, and to act on the assessment without the hesitation that uncertain people brought to everything. I said, "Yes." She said, "I was in country the year before. I knew about the action." The café was doing what Augusta cafés did at 8:40 on a Tuesday morning. The pour-overs and the exposed brick and the specific morning energy of a city going about its business in the specific way of a city that was old enough to have developed its own rhythms and that had no particular interest in changing them. Her assistant had moved to the counter. The 2 other people she had come in with had found a table. It was just the 2 of us at my table with the napkins and the coffee and the scar and the specific quality of a morning that had stopped being ordinary. She said, "I'm Sloan Mercer." I said, "I know. Your assistant called you Ms. Mercer when you came in." She said, "Right." She sat down. Let me tell you who I was before that Tuesday morning in Augusta, because the scar has a story, and the story is where everything begins. I grew up in Augusta, Georgia. Not the Augusta of the Masters. The Augusta of the residential neighborhoods in the hill section where my mother Helen had raised me in a house that was old enough to have personality and that she had maintained for 30 years with the specific determined attention of someone who understood that a house was not a possession, but a relationship. My father had left when I was 9. Not dramatically. The specific slow leaving of someone who had decided he was more suited to somewhere else and who had been honest enough about this to eventually go. My mother had handled it with the specific quality she brought to everything, which was to look at what was there and organize her life around it, rather than around what was not. I had gone to Augusta Technical College for 2 years and had enlisted in the Army at 21 in 2008 with the specific clarity of someone who had decided what he wanted to do and who had stopped waiting to feel ready to do it. I had been in Savannah for a summer job the year before and had met a man named George at a 4th of July gathering. A veteran, older, who had spoken about his service without inflation or nostalgia and who had made the specific quality of military service feel like the right quality for someone who did not yet know what the right quality for himself was. I had become a ranger. Not immediately. The path was long, and the qualification course was the specific sustained challenge of something designed to show you what you were made of by removing everything you thought you were made of and seeing what remained. What had remained in my case was enough. I had gone through and had been assigned to 1st Ranger Battalion at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah and had spent the following 13 years doing the specific work of a ranger in the years when the work was significant and continuous. 4 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, 1 to the Philippines. The specific operational tempo of a decade of continuous deployment that had shaped my body and my thinking in ways I was still discovering in 2025. I had married Anne in 2014, after Kunar, in the specific sequence of events that serious things produced, which was that the Kunar action had clarified for me what I wanted the rest of my life to contain, and Anne was the clearest answer to that question I had ever encountered. She was a marine biologist at the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta, which was where we had met at an event I had attended because my team leader's wife had insisted, and which I had attended with the specific resignation of someone attending an event because someone else had insisted. I had met Anne at the sea turtle exhibit. Fern had been born in 2017. Anne had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2021. The aggressive kind, the kind that arrived without significant warning and that had been in the wrong stage when it was found and that had moved faster than the treatment. She died in March 2022. Fern was 4 years old. I had left the Army in 2021, before Anne died, when the diagnosis had made it clear that the life I needed to build was the one that was here rather than the one that was deployed. I had come back to Augusta, to my mother Helen's city, to the house in the hill section where I had grown up, to the specific quality of a place that held you without requiring you to perform your history for it. I worked as a security consultant. Not exciting work in the way that my previous work had been. Important work, which was a different thing. The specific work of helping organizations and individuals understand what they were exposed to and how to manage the exposure. It was sufficient. It paid correctly. It was mine. The scar on my left shoulder was the permanent record of March 14, 2014. I did not discuss it. I wore the Medal of Honor lapel pin sometimes. A small thing, a 1/4 inch, easily missed by people who did not know what they were looking at. I had the scar. I could not help the scar. The action in Kunar province had happened on a Tuesday. I want to tell you about it the way I have been telling myself about it for 11 years, without the version that appears in the citation, which is accurate but which has the specific quality of official documents that organize events into a shape that emphasizes the outcome over the experience. My patrol had been 6 men. We had been on a reconnaissance mission in the Peck River Valley in Kunar province, terrain that was beautiful in the specific way of places that were also dangerous, the mountains and the river and the quality of a landscape that did not care what happened in it. The IED detonated at 08:47. The vehicle in front of mine, Davis Hale and Tom Garza's vehicle, took the primary blast. Both of them were hit immediately. Davis was down with wounds to his legs. Tom had a head injury and was not conscious. The small arms fire started 11 seconds after the IED. 3 directions. The specific tactical situation of an ambush designed by people who knew what they were doing and who had chosen the terrain correctly. I moved to Davis and Tom. This is what the citation describes as actions above and beyond the call of duty. I understand why it requires that language. I did not experience it as a decision. I experienced it as movement. The specific directed movement of someone who understood that Davis and Tom were in the wrong place and that the wrong place was going to be fatal in approximately 90 seconds and that someone needed to move them. I was shot in the left shoulder approximately 20 feet from Davis's position. I did not stop. I was shot in the left side approximately 10 feet from Tom's position. I got both of them to the cover of the vehicle. I held that position for 22 minutes until the extraction arrived. Davis Hale lives in Colorado. He lost his left leg below the knee. He is married and has 2 daughters and coaches youth soccer on Saturday mornings, which he has told me with the specific combination of pride and amusement that the situation warranted. A man who lost his left leg below the knee, coaching youth soccer on Saturday mornings. Tom Garza lives in San Antonio. The traumatic brain injury had consequences that he managed with the specific patient discipline of someone who had decided the consequences were not going to determine the shape of his life. He worked. He was present for his family. He called me on my birthday every year without fail. I called both of them on March 14th. I had received the Medal of Honor in November 2014 at the White House. I had stood in the East Room, and the President had placed the medal around my neck and had said things that were true and that I had not known how to receive, because the receiving of formal recognition for something you did not experience as a choice was a specific and difficult thing, and I had not been prepared for the difficulty of it. I had worn the medal at the ceremony and had put it in its case and had not worn it since. I wore the lapel pin sometimes. I had the scar always. Sloan Mercer had commissioned through ROTC at the University of Georgia in 2004 and had served as an Army officer for 10 years, leaving as a captain in 2014, the same year as Kunar, the same year she would have read about the action in her final weeks of service. She told me this at my table in the café with the napkins still in her hands. She had been in Afghanistan in 2013, her final deployment a year before the Kunar action, in an adjacent area of operations. She had known about Kunar after it happened because the action had been significant enough that it circulated through the officer community even after the classification restrictions were addressed. She said, "I knew the citation. I didn't know you were in Augusta." I said, "I grew up here. I came back." She said, "I moved to the company's southeast office here 2 years ago. I'm still learning the city." I said, "What are you learning?" She said that it has a specific quality I can't name. It's not like Atlanta. It's not like Savannah. It's something else. I said, "It knows what it is. Cities that know what they are have that quality." She said, "Yes, that's exactly it." She had set the napkins down. She was looking at me with the specific quality of someone who had said what needed to be said and who was now in a different kind of conversation, the kind that did not require the formality of the previous kind. She said, I laughed. I said, "It was an accident." She said, "The coffee was an accident. The laugh was a reflex. I'm still responsible for both." I said, "People laugh when they're startled." She said, "I'm a former Army officer. I've been in situations where laughter was the wrong response and I've controlled it. I should have controlled it here." I said, "Ms. Mercer." She said, "Sloan." I said, "Sloan, you spilled coffee on me and laughed for 1 second and then you apologized. I don't need the self-critique." She said, "I know you don't need it. I need to say it." I looked at her. She said, "I knew who you were the moment I saw the scar. The position of the entry wound means you were moving toward the contact when you were hit. That's not something people do by accident. I knew what it meant and I knew about the action and I laughed at the man who did what you did and I need to have said that I'm sorry for that." I said, "All right." She said, "All right?" I said, "All right, I accept the apology. Now can we—" She said, "What you did was—" I said, "What it needed to be." She stopped. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Yes, that's exactly what it was." We sat in the specific quiet of 2 people who had said what needed to be said and who were now on the other side of it. She said, "What unit?" I said, "1st Ranger Battalion." She said, "Good outfit." I said, "Yes." She said, "What did you do after?" I said, "Security consulting. I'm here this morning for a courthouse meeting." She said, "I have a meeting in—" She checked her watch, "in 11 minutes. I said, "I have one in 15. She said, "Can I buy you another coffee?" I said, "The coffee was fine. I wasn't done with it." She said, "That's why I'm offering." I said, "All right." She bought me a coffee and she sat across from me and we had 12 minutes before her meeting, and we used them. She asked about Augusta. I told her about the squares. Not the master's squares, the city squares, the specific grid of them that organized the city in the way that Savannah's squares organized Savannah, which was by giving you a reason to stop every few blocks and understand where you were. I told her about the light in April, the specific quality of a morning in Augusta in April when the pollen had done its worst and was beginning to relent, and the light through the trees had the quality of something that had been filtered carefully and was now arriving at exactly the right intensity. She listened the way officers listen to terrain briefings, completely noting things. She asked about my work. I told her what I did, the assessment and the consulting and the occasional historic preservation contract that was the specific enjoyable anomaly in an otherwise security-focused practice. She asked intelligent questions about the preservation work, which told me she had a genuine interest in buildings and the specific intelligence to ask about them correctly. She said, "Your daughter." I said, "Fern, she's 8, 3rd grade." She said, "What is Fern like?" I thought about this. I thought about the specific quality of an 8-year-old who had arrived at her opinions about the world with the same directness her mother had brought to her opinions about marine biology, which was complete certainty arrived at through careful observation. I said, "She has strong opinions about sea turtles." Sloan said, "What kind of opinions?" I said, she believes the general public is severely underinformed about sea turtles, and she has taken it upon herself to address this. She has a notebook. She makes notes about people's knowledge gaps so she can return to them. I paused. Her mother was a marine biologist. The sea turtles are Fern's way of keeping that. Sloane said, she keeps a list of people who need more sea turtle education. I said, she calls it her project. Sloane said, she's right, about the knowledge gap. I said, I know more about sea turtles than I expected to know at this point in my life. She said, is her mother? She stopped herself. I said, she died in 2022. Ovarian cancer. Fern was 4. She said, I'm sorry. I said, thank you. A pause. The cafe around us. Augusta doing what it did. She said, how is Fern? I said, she's good. She's genuinely good. She has the specific quality of a child who has looked at what's there and organized her life around it. She doesn't perform being okay. She actually is. Sloane said, she sounds like someone. I said, her mother. Sloane said, yes. She looked at her watch. She said, I have to go. She reached into her jacket and took out a card and put it on the table. She said, I don't know what this is, but I talked to you for 12 minutes and I'd like to continue the conversation at some point that isn't the morning I spilled coffee on you. I looked at the card. She said, the squares, the light in April, your daughter's project. I'm not done with any of it. I said, Ms. Mercer? She said, Sloane. I said, Sloane. I don't usually. She said, I know. Neither do I. I picked up the card. She left. I sat in the cafe with the new coffee and the card and the specific quality of a Tuesday morning in Augusta that had not been what I had expected it to be. My courthouse meeting was about a historic building on Broad Street, a 1890s commercial building whose owner wanted to understand the security implications of a proposed renovation that would change several access points. Standard work. I had done this kind of assessment many times. I sat in the meeting and gave the assessment and listened to the questions and answered the questions and did the work correctly the way I always did the work. The card was in my jacket pocket. I thought about the 12 minutes. I had not talked to anyone about Kunar in a long time, not because I was unwilling, because there were very few people who could receive what Kunar was without the conversation becoming about something other than what it was. Davis called me every March 14th. Tom called me on my birthday. My mother knew the outline. Sloane Mercer had known before I said anything. She had seen the scar, and she had named the place and the year, and she had known what it meant that I had been facing the direction the round came from. She had not made it something other than what it was. She had also laughed for 1 second, and had said she was responsible for the laugh and had been precise about why. I thought about that. I thought about the specific quality of someone who held themselves accountable in the specific precise way of someone who had learned accountability in an environment that did not tolerate the alternative. I thought about the 12 minutes. I finished the meeting at 11. I walked out of the courthouse into the Augusta April morning, and the light was doing what I had told Sloane it did, filtered through the trees at exactly the right intensity, the specific quality of a morning that had decided to be what it was without apology. I had to pick up Fern at 2:30. She came out of the school at 2:32 with her backpack and her notebook, the project notebook, which she carried everywhere on the grounds that the knowledge gap could present itself at any moment and required immediate documentation. She got in the truck and said, "How was your meeting?" I said, "Good, I had an interesting morning." She said, "What happened?" I said, "Someone spilled coffee on me." She said, "Were they sorry?" I said, "Yes." She was very sorry. She said, "She bought you another one." I said, "Yes." She considered this. She said, "That's the right thing to do." I said, "Yes." She opened the notebook. She was working on something. A diagram I could see from the corner of my eye, the specific, focused quality of a child who had a system and who worked the system. After a while, she said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Did you tell her about me?" I said, "I did." She said, "What did you say?" I said you had a project about sea turtles, and that you kept notes on people's knowledge gaps so you could return to them." She looked up from the notebook. She said, "What did she say?" I said, "She said you were right about the knowledge gap." Fern thought about this. She said, She sounds intelligent. I said, She is. She said, Is she on the list? I said, The project list. She said, The knowledge gap list. I said, I don't know yet. I'd have to ask her. Fern said, You should find out. I said, I'll find out. She said, When? I said, I don't know yet. Soon. She went back to the notebook. I drove through the Augusta afternoon. The streets I had known since I was 9 years old, the specific accumulated familiarity of a place that had held me in different versions of myself for 38 years, and that was holding me now in this version, which was the version that had a daughter with a notebook and a courthouse meeting and a card in his jacket pocket from a woman who had talked to him for 12 minutes about the squares and the light in April and sea turtles. I thought about the scar. I had not asked for the scar. It was the consequence of March 14th, 2014, of doing what needed to be done in a specific terrain at a specific time and of being in the path of the consequences of doing it. I had carried it for 11 years as the specific evidence of a morning that I did not regret and that I would not exchange, and that had cost me a permanent mark on my body and a series of conversations I had not known how to have. Sloane Mercer had seen the scar and had known immediately what it was and what it meant. She had not made it more than it was. She had not made it less. She had said, What you did was, and I had said, what it needed to be. And she had stopped and said, Yes, that's exactly what it was. And I had understood in that moment that she was one of the small number of people who could receive the true version of the thing without converting it into something easier to hold. That was worth something. That was worth a phone call. Fern said, without looking up from the notebook, Dad. I said, Yeah. She said, The lady who spilled the coffee. I said, Yes. She said, She was in the army too, wasn't she? I looked at my daughter. She said, You have a different voice when you talk about people who were in the army, like you already know them a little. I said, Yes, she was. Fern said, Good. She went back to the notebook. I drove home with my daughter and the April afternoon and the card in my jacket pocket and the specific quality of a morning that had started as an accident and that had not stayed one. Some mornings knew what they were. This one had taken its time deciding. It had gotten there. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Has there been a moment in your life when something that began as an accident, a spill, a wrong turn, a missed bus, turned out to be the beginning of something that mattered? Sometimes the things that were supposed to ruin the morning are the things the morning needed. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.